informal Q&A and that sort of thing, okay? So as far as that goes, yes, glad to see your family celebrating, Dasha. Good to see Victory Day, because that's, of course, World War II, so it's a good day to be talking like that. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead. I'm going to, again, share my screen with you, and we will go ahead and take a look at the 1920s, okay? Okay, so we might have forgotten about to, forgot to record, but we are recording now, ladies and gentlemen. So again, a little bit on the 20s and then the Great Depression and World War II. So let's go ahead and share my screen with you. And we will get into, let's see. All right, so let's look at my presentations here. Now, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, going into the 1920s, okay, we're going to go into a little bit of economic and foreign policy, because those are going to be things we're going to be looking at. Okay, so first of all, on Warren G. Harding's cabinet, you've got Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce, and Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Andrew Mellon was a successful businessman and also a tax cutter, all right? So Andrew Mellon, now this is half of Carnegie Mellon University, in Pittsburgh. Now the other half here was Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Mellon was also a philanthropist. It tended to be that in the 1920s, the conventional wisdom was, let's get people from business and put them in charge of government, which the current president's view of setting up a cabinet is in some ways kind of similar here. So you've got Andrew Mellon, who believed in cutting taxes. Now, this was kind of counterintuitive in a way, because we had a lot of war debt. And so the problem that Andrew Mellon was facing was, how are we going to collect this war debt and repay it? And so this may not make sense right at first glance, because you think, okay, we need revenue, then we need to raise taxes. But actually, what Mellon's saying is that lower taxes can actually create more revenue. Sometimes you have a short-term drop in revenue, but long-term, you're going to see the tax revenue pick up, because lower taxes tend to stimulate the economy. And he wrote a book on it, Taxation, the People's Business. He wrote, The History of Taxation shows that taxes which are inherently excessive are not paid. And so as far as that goes, we've got some examples there. I mean, in 2011, I remember reading here about GE filing this huge tax return, $14 billion in profits, and they didn't pay any taxes. And so as far as that goes, if the corporate taxes were lower, which they have been lowered more recently, then, maybe they wouldn't be going out of their way to avoid paying taxes. And now the thing is, when I say this is a myth, you've got to keep in mind that your exam may perpetuate this myth, okay? So, because Andrew Mellon did cut taxes for the rich, okay? But let me show you the whole picture here, just so you know. Now, as far as this goes, now remember, these dollars are pre-Federal Reserve dollars. And so when you're looking at, okay, World War I taxes versus, 1926 taxes, well, of course, it looks like the wealthy got a really big tax cut here, because during the war, they were paying a 75% tax rate, which is completely unsustainable. I mean, even Bernie, would say that the top taxes should be somewhere around here, around 55%, what you see maybe at these 1922 levels. So, even Bernie Sanders would be calling for a tax cut for the rich when you look at this here. And so it looks like when you look at this graph, like, whoa, the rich are getting these big tax cuts. But then let's not take our eyes off of here, because remember when the federal government during the Progressive era, they said, oh, let's collect an income tax. They said, oh, you're not going to feel a thing. I mean, notice that the top tax rate was 8%, even about 7% on the super rich. And so then it goes to about 10 or 12% for the super rich. And then, bam, okay, you let government get their foot in the door on the income tax thing, and then all of a sudden the door is just flying wide open here. Now, speaking of, if you just look at it, if you take out the war, and let's look at taxes 1916 to 1926. Well, the thing is that you see that in 1916, the wealthy are paying 12% in taxes, and then they're paying 25% in taxes in 1926. In fact, under Mellon's tax plan, the only group that was paying less in 1926 than they were paying in 1916 was the lowest tax bracket. So, be careful how you look at historical evidence. Now, remember, your exam may say Andrew Mellon cut taxes for the rich and that sort of thing. But you look at what the rich were paying during the war, and then you compare it to pre-war levels. But Andrew Mellon did believe that, you see here a top tax rate of 25%. He believed that this is the tax that people will actually pay. They're not going to try to avoid it. It's not going to disincentivize business. But the 20s were generally very, very friendly to business. Now, Mellon, in my view, was kind of scapegoated to some extent for the Great Depression. But, there were a lot of people that blamed his policies for that, because, there was this rapid economic growth. But then again, there was also a lot of rampant consumerism and consumer debt at this time, which we should be well aware of because of the installment plan. You want to remember the installment plan combined with all of these new all these new electronic gadgets, like for the first time you've got an electric iron, vacuum cleaner and stuff like that. I mean, things that these electric appliances, and because of cheap credit policies from the Federal Reserve, you've got, because of these cheap credit policies, it is, it's easy to get credit. And so, then all of a sudden the credit tightened up. But Mellon was definitely somebody that people went after when the Depression happened. It goes back to Jefferson here. It may be the pleasure and pride of an American to ask what farmer, what mechanic, what laborer ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States. It's like the lower classes were paying almost nothing, on taxes, and a lot of this debt was paid. So when you look at this here, the left axis is the tax share paid by the wealthy, the tax paid, and then the tax rate. So when you see the tax rate going down, taxes paid were actually going up, as was the share in taxes of those with incomes over $1,000. So it seems counterintuitive, but when you look at the empirical data, it seemed to work for the 1920s. Well, then people would ask, why the Great Depression? I can show you some things about how Herbert Hoover handled the Great Depression, okay? And so as far as that goes, even though taxes were cut, we see here that, above 100,000 goes from paying 29% of the taxes to paying 61% of the taxes. And so as far as that goes, you got Calvin Coolidge, who was very, popular at that time, and he said the business of the American people is business. He believed firmly that the American government should be, the federal government should be there to assist business and really, in a lot of ways, just stay out of the way and provide a business-friendly climate. Business-friendly climate. He who builds a factory builds a temple. He who works there worships there. Now, this was not necessarily like a great time to be, a farmer or a member of a labor union or something like that, but it certainly was a good time to be a member of the middle class. During this time of Coolidge prosperity, low taxes, balanced budget, very robust economy, and silent cow. Now, as far as this goes, Calvin Coolidge did pretty well. Of course, the Solid South. Remember the phenomenon of the Solid South at this time, that you can see the former Confederacy voting Democratic if you include Oklahoma, and then the rest of the country voting Republican. Lafayette was, if I even said that right, it's a written test, from Wisconsin, was a progressive Republican, and of course the Solid South voting Democratic. Now, this was in 1924, and keeping cool with Coolidge. Now, 1920 foreign policy. Now, one thing we want to note here is that Woodrow Wilson had a very internationalist foreign policy. And Warren G. Harding, when he ran against Calvin, sorry about that. This is getting to me too. I know this exam thing's getting to everybody. But Warren G. Harding had this American first foreign policy message, which it sounds familiar. President Trump has taken this in a very similar situation, because Woodrow Wilson tended to have a more internationalist view of foreign policy, that the United States should be a participating member of the global community and make decisions based on what's best for the world, and the United States being a participant. President Obama had some aspects of Wilsonian foreign policy, and you see with with Warren G. Harding and more recently with Donald Trump going in more of a direction of what they call foreign policy realism, a foreign policy that's not necessarily promoting ideals, but what they see as the realities in a competitive world and promoting American self-interest. And so this America first foreign policy. Now, a lot of times there's this idea that U.S. foreign policy was isolationist. Okay, now isolationist is a pretty strong word. Remember, nobody uses this word to apply to themselves. George W. Bush even said when he was giving a talk a while back, so, the 20s, it's like, who cares what happens in Europe? But at the same time, that's not necessarily what Calvin Coolidge said here. That the United States, it's not isolationism as much as what we would call unilateralism. And really, the United States government did a great deal to try to further the spirit of the 14 points. So in the 1920s, the United States exercised world leadership in three ways: the Washington Naval Conference, the Dawes Plan, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Now, the Washington Naval Conference was about arms control and it tried to avoid another arms race. Remember that one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was the reduction of arms. And so, we see here that although the United States didn't join the League of Nations, that we still have that the United States is an agent of the 14 points. And so we have these naval ratios that are adopted. Britain and the U.S. will have 5 ships, 5 carriers. This is a ratio, so if they could do 10, 10, and 6, and then Japan would have 3. Now, Japan wanted to make sure they weren't 2.5. They wanted their fleet to be larger than half of the United States fleet, because remember that the United States and Britain at the time had to employ multiple fleets, which the United States still has an Atlantic and a Pacific fleet. Now, as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, we're trying to find, my students and I are trying to find out if there's an original dreadnought anywhere. Like, my history, more history nerd students and I are kind of upset because they dismantled, like the original HMS Dreadnought was sold for scrap after the war, and so was the USS South Carolina. So I'm still on the lookout for an but people, they weren't thinking about like history tourism and stuff like that. And so these dreadnoughts were dismantled. It makes me upset, but they thought they were doing the right thing at the time. So the first thing is the United States had, other countries come to the United States to figure out the naval ratios and how to reduce armaments. Then you've got the Dawes Plan. Now remember that this is different than the Dawes Act in 1887. And what happened here is that Germany owed reparations to the Allies. The Allies owed debt to the United States. The United States had some extra money. We used to, at this time, be a creditor nation. Now we're a debtor nation. And so the U.S. would pay, they gave loans to Germany. Germany would give part of that to the Allies. And then the Allies would give $2.6 billion to the United States. So everybody is ending up with, with something that is valuable to them. And because of the Dawes Plan, Dawes was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Now, are they Nazis, Walter? The Nazis were not very grateful for this. It says here that break the Dawes chains. Okay, that you've got the, the Dawes Plan is enchaining Germany. Of course, they're Nazis. We're going to take that with a grain of salt, right? And then finally, there's the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounced war as an instrument of national policy. And it's called Kellogg-Briand after the U.S. Secretary of State and the French foreign minister, but several nations signed it. Lots of nations signed it, including Japan. Japan signed this, and then a few years later invaded Manchuria. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, as far as that goes, I've got a website. And so, ladies and gentlemen, going into that, we've got the 1920s. Let me go ahead and see if we want to take a few questions here, so that I can see what's coming up. I'm going to look at the Q&A. Okay, what do you mean would this fall into modern day Republican or Democrat? Okay. Um, I'm not sure what that means there. Now, what I want to do, okay, is kind of go into a little bit of a skill-based thing, and let's think about the way, it's like you look at the Great Depression, and let's think about comparing the way that Herbert Hoover, handled the Great Depression versus FDR's New Deal, okay? Now, did the tax cut contribute to the stock market crash in any way? Now, I am not an economist. Lucy, I'll get to that. I'll get to Lend-Lease in a little bit, okay? I'm not an economist, but as far as that goes, a lot of people are buying stocks on the margin, okay? The thing is that any kind of speculation tends to be bad for the economy. Now, remember, when we're talking about speculation, okay, what we're talking about is if somebody buys stock, they're supposed to be buying stock so that, because they believe in the company. So if I were to buy stock in Apple Computer, then I plan to hold on to it. Is it even Apple Computer anymore? They still make computers. But, if I were to buy stock in Apple, then what I'm thinking is that after that, okay, after I buy stock in Apple, I'm going to keep it there for a while because I think that Apple has potential for long-term growth. Now, speculation is where I'm thinking in terms of, oh, you know what? I think that this stock's going to go up, right for a little bit, and then maybe it'll go down. So I'm going to make a short-term little thing here, and a lot of people are playing the market. And it's never good when people are speculating in the stock market, and they're able to speculate because of cheap credit. Okay, they're speculating because of cheap credit. Now, there are different ways to look at the Great Depression and the causes and all of that. Now, I personally tend to give a lot of credibility to people who blame Hoover. Okay, so it's like you could look back in the 1920s and be like, oh, da-da-da-da-da. But then let's think about how Hoover is responding to the Great Depression. So let's think about this, ladies and gentlemen. So if we're thinking about in terms of if we want to compare, evaluate the extent to which Hoover's responses and the New Deal were different from each other in responding to the Great Depression. Now, if we think about Hoover's responses, okay, so Hoover saw, the stock market crash happens, things are starting to get a little antsy with the economy. I would say, now, a lot of people have this myth that, Hoover just sat there twiddling his thumbs and Hoover didn't do anything, and then FDR comes in with the New Deal and he does something. The thing is that Hoover was by trade an engineer. And so when something was going wrong, Hoover thought, I can fix this. Now, before the Great Depression, you tend to call it a panic. Now, there was what was called a long depression sometime before that. But typically there'd be a panic because the way the market works, it has, ups and downs. The market has mechanisms to correct itself. But what Hoover does was he advocated a tax increase, okay, which, most people that know anything about economics would say that this is not the time for a tax increase. Now, one thing we need to remember is the influence of Keynesian economics, okay? John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics as far as, Keynesian. Now, this was FDR's economics. Now, Keynesian economics says that, you should, deficit spend during an economic downturn. But Hoover was still trying to keep the budget balance. So he's like, how are we going to keep the budget balance? We need a tax increase. But generally, tax increases during economic downturns are bad things. Now, Hoover signed the Hawley-Smoot tariff or the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It's not a big deal. Now, when the economy's bad, basically, this was the second highest tariff in U.S. history, the highest being, wait for it, the Tariff of Abominations, the Tariff of 1828. So you have a tax increase, then Hoover signs the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Now, the Hawley-Smoot tariff is something that stops, goods from moving around, okay? So he's increased taxes. Now, he asked businesses to create a voluntary wage freeze, okay? Now, here's the thing, that when there's a downturn, wages want to go down. But Hoover was like, let's keep wages where they are. And because of that, they weren't hiring people when somebody was fired, if you think about it, now nobody likes their wages to be cut, but would you rather your wages cut or would you rather get fired or laid off or something like, would you rather get laid off? And so the final thing that, let's see, so as far as that goes, yeah, I'm having almost a Rick Perry moment, or maybe I've got everything here. There was also the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and that sort of thing. Now, what Hoover did not do, okay, what Hoover did not do, so you could mention, remember, I don't want to get too many pieces of evidence in one of these paragraphs, because then the evidence just starts crowding out and you lose the quality of the evidence, okay? Now, what he did not do is direct relief, okay? So direct relief, all right, this was something that he was not willing to do, that Hoover wanted to tinker around with things, so increase taxes, then, have this high tariff, but don't give people direct relief. Hoover believed that there was a limit, although Hoover did have a willingness to use the power of government here. Okay, and so now when you look at the New Deal, we could go into any of those New Deal agencies. Now remember, as I noted, Keynesian economics, okay, which championed deficit spending, okay, deficit spending meaning that the government's going to go into debt during this economic downturn. And then you have direct relief, okay? You have what are called the make work projects, okay? That's like the CCC and the PWA and stuff like that. He's building infrastructure and that sort of thing. Also there was, the attempt to regulate business, okay? That was through the NRA, which was not the NRA that's the interest group today, but the NRA that, the National Recovery Administration, which regulated business. Now, Hoover, you compare that to a voluntary wage freeze. So what I would say here is what they have in common is both, intervened, okay? So both Hoover and FDR tried many interventions, okay, many interventions, many government interventions to help to try to address the Depression, okay, to address the Depression. Okay, so they both tried many government interventions. Now, FDR's went further, okay, so although FDR's interventions went further in, in allowing direct relief, right? Now, also, another thing is that what do we know about the New Deal? Now, the New Deal, and this is pretty much something, this is not very controversial what I'm going to say here, okay? About the New Deal is that the New Deal was the New Deal programs, okay? So neither president's programs were effective, okay, in bringing back the economy, okay, in getting the economy back on track, okay, because the economic upturn does not begin until war production starts, until Europeans start killing each other, and then you see this, okay? So that's a similarity there. So a similarity here is that they both tried a lot of government interventions, and neither one of the presidents was successful. Now, FDR at least appeared to be doing more, okay? That's something that, a lot of times in politics that plays well, if the president at least appears to be trying to help. And so this is the sort of thing here that we need to keep in mind, that yes, Hoover tried to address the problems of the Great Depression. He just did a lot of the wrong things. Now, could somebody else, make different arguments about the Great Depression? Sure, I'm just showing you a way to argue this, but if I had to compare Herbert Hoover and the New Deal, I would note here that they're both trying interventions. FDR is going further, and neither one of them, that if Hoover had not responded to the economic downturn with a tax increase, a high tariff, trying to mess with wages and stuff, we might not even be having this conversation right now. The Great Depression may not have happened. Now, note, there would be historians that would agree with what I just said and historians that might disagree with what I just said, but that's the beauty of history, is that, it does allow room for vigorous and healthy debate. Okay, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to now I wouldn't necessarily associate Coolidge with, nationalism, but certainly, Coolidge was a champion of unilateral foreign policy, okay? So, as far as that. Now, the major tax jumps, that's more of an economic, question, but there we go. Now, yeah, I don't personally think that the taxes did that, but then again, we're getting into some pretty complex stuff here. I think, for me, I see a lot more evidence. Of course, again, I'm not an economist. I'm a history teacher. But I see a lot more evidence for the cheap credit being the culprit and people, becoming indebted, as far as that goes. We'll talk about that. Let's see, details, Coolidge or Harding. The thing is that I would note that Coolidge was very friendly to business, okay, that you've got during the 1920s a very business-friendly climate in the government. Yeah, and so doesn't matter. This is what APUSH is about, challenging myths, okay? That what you've got to remember, I thought Hoover didn't do anything. Well, maybe in comparison to FDR, it wasn't as ambitious, but I'm not lying to you about any of this. You can look in your textbook and you'll see where, yes, Hoover, did try to tinker with some things to try to solve the problems of the Great Depression. It's just a lot of times when people try to do things, that's it. All right. So as far as that goes, can I please explain the causes? Okay, the Mexican-American War, we've already done that one. Okay, we're focusing on the, now I'm going to be going on to World War II. All right. So, that basically, the Great Depression continued until war production started. And you can look at, a graph of U.S. GDP, which I've actually, that could be something they could put on the exam, where you have to look at a graph of U.S. GDP during the 1930s, Allison. But yes, that FDR tried a lot of government programs. Now, remember that the New Deal was about the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. And as far as relief, it did a great job of that. Recovery, not so much. Getting the economy back on track, not so much. Now, it did also, though, provide a lot of meaningful reforms, okay? So I don't think that, I think it's Kennedy, who's like the big historian of FDR and the New Deal, he'll tell you, those programs didn't do anything for the economy, but he claims that those programs, set up, America for, the next stage of development. Because before that, you think about it, it's like Social Security and stuff like that, having a system of old age pensions, regulating the stock market and having a federal agency that's looking at insider trading and stuff like that. So was FDR, okay, so ladies and gentlemen, yes, what I would do here, Haley, is I wouldn't say you necessarily need to know all of the New Deal programs. You've got the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, I would focus on 2 or 3 of them, okay? What I tend to do, I kind of go by the rule of 2 or 3. And that tends, that any kind of thing that's going on, I try to find 2 or 3 things, because remember that the majority of the test is asking you to produce your own evidence. So a lot of the exam is not going to be, the multiple choice tends to be more general. And so you tend to produce specific evidence on the SAQs, the LEQ, the DBQ, and you could be asked, what was the impact of New Deal programs? So if you've got 2 or 3 New Deal programs up your sleeve that you can describe at length, that in some detail in multiple sentences, then I think that's going to be better for you than if you're trying to do that. Ryan, I'm glad you mentioned something. If you go to, and I'll get this set up on tomrichey.net/APUSH. Actually, if you just go to tomrichey.net, go to my online store, I am doing another multiple choice strategy session tonight. It's a premium session. It costs $10 to get in. But the one I did last night had some technical difficulties, so I'm actually doing it again. So if you go to tomrichey.net and go to the online store, you'll see the multiple choice strategy session if you're interested in that. All right. So, yes, now that's not really Mr. Betts, is it? Yes, Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States struck down the NRA on the basis of the Commerce Clause. And remember that FDR had a lot of conflicts with the Supreme Court. Okay. So as far as that's going, ladies and gentlemen, as far as that, now the difference between the first New Deal and the second New Deal, I don't see that being like a big thing on your exam, okay? Like that's really one of those things that understanding the new deal, I just wouldn't, I think you're getting into the weeds there, Priyanka, that, that are really, I don't see how that's necessary for somebody studying a survey level course to understand the difference between the first New Deal and the second New Deal, but it's just that you've got different waves of legislation, all right? So as far as that goes, yeah, I would just not prioritize that in my studying necessarily. So as far as that, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and go, because Lucy, you have asked, what is it called where we loaned ships to Britain? All right, Selena is here. Awesome, awesome. Okay, so like I said, Thomas, that I would pick like a handful, like just 2 or 3 New Deal programs and focus on those. But I'm going to go ahead for the purpose of this webinar, because remember, we've only got an hour a night. Then I'm going to go, nice job, Addison. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and talk about American neutrality, okay? I'm going to talk about this in some detail, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about American neutrality, the U.S. and the European War, okay? So now I'm going to skip through some of this stuff here as well and kind of just go through and hit the main points, all right? So 1936 to 1931. Now remember, the United States in the 1920s that we're trying to do what we can to implement the 14 points, and then the world just goes crazy. Now remember, Woodrow Wilson said that we were going to make the world safe for democracy. Kids, remember to hydrate this week. It's very important. Both your body and your brain will appreciate it. All right, so as far as this is going, ladies and gentlemen, totalitarianism. What we see instead of the world being safe for democracy is these governments that really undermine the individual, okay, that really undermine liberal democracy. In those terms that, a democracy based on principles of freedom and individualism. And that's what Woodrow Wilson told Americans, that in addition to opposing unrestricted submarine warfare, this is what we were supposed to be fighting for. And so you start to see these governments that are into militarism, dictatorship, censorship, repression in the Soviet Union, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And so all of these countries here are adopting these repressive, militaristic, governments that don't allow, and they don't place a priority on individual expression. You see that the Japanese, who in a few years before signed on to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, well, they go into Manchuria. And, so then they're condemned by the League of Nations. Japan then just walks out of the League of Nations. And so then Germany is expanding as well. And the League of Nations proves to be very ineffective in handling this. Like I said, they censure Japan. Japan walks out. Germany, they try to deal with Hitler. This is something I call appeasement, which not I call appeasement. This is something called appeasement. Okay, it's not like I made this up. So appeasement, I kind of think like a baby. When a baby's crying, you give it the pacifier, you hold it and all of that kind of stuff, make sure its diaper's okay, and then you put it down, and then the baby's quiet for a little bit, and then it starts back up. That's appeasement, okay? Now, people thought that Hitler could be, could be bargained with, that Hitler only has some very limited goals. So there's Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, and Adolf Hitler signing the Munich Agreement. Now, they thought they had peace for our time, but not so much. When Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939, then that started World War II, okay? So Hitler, basically takes France down. The British are, fighting the Battle of Britain. And then the United States still isn't involved, but Germany and Japan and Italy, they agree that they're going to cooperate, that if one of the contracting powers is attacked by a power at present not involved in the European War or in the Japanese-Chinese conflict, they'll all help each other. And so, of course, this is aimed at the United States. At us next time, right? And so the situation in 1940, because France pretty much fell quick, is that you've got this Axis Pact, and the only really allied nation is the British. and the Soviet Union and the United States are maintaining neutrality. And so the world seems to be falling apart. And remember that Americans, from an American's perspective, what does this have to do with us? Remember the Washingtonian, Jeffersonian foreign policy that said that, there's really like, what does that have to do with the United States? The United States should not be getting involved in these foreign entanglements. World War I didn't go so well, okay? World War I didn't go so well as far as the United States, after the war, we lost 100,000 people, another few 100,000 wounded, and for what? What did we gain from that? We gained a world that just had gone crazy. And so there was a lot of buyer's remorse. This was the first time the United States had ever gotten into a European war, and that was, that was it. That was, look, it didn't go so well. We didn't get what we wanted out of that, and that was a mistake. So they're going into that thinking, that was a mistake. And so, we see this attitude of so-called isolationism or non-intervention, remember, isolationism is a pejorative term. People typically don't use that to self-describe. Nobody, I'm an isolationist, not so much. Now, the Neutrality Acts, these were passed in 1936, 37, 39, and these were acts that prohibited the sale of arms to belligerents. Now, there was a report called the Nye Report. Senator Nye, not Bill Nye, not anybody related to him, I don't think, but the Nye Report said that the reason the United States had gotten into World War I is because we were basically drawn in by arms manufacturers who had self-interested motives. Remember that the Lusitania didn't just have passengers on it. The Lusitania had armaments on it as well. And so the United States, if we don't sell arms to belligerents, then we're not going to be drawn into this war. Now, on the other side, we don't want to be drawn into the war, but if Britain's left on its own, then, Hitler might conquer Britain if Britain doesn't have our help. And so FDR was determined that the United States would serve as the arsenal of democracy. And there are three components to the United States as the arsenal of democracy. You might think of this in a similar light as Nixon's Vietnamization policy, that, during the Nixon administration, we take troops out and we provide equipment and advice and stuff like that. Now, cash and carry, destroyers for bases, and lend-lease, okay? So these are three programs that our federal government does in order to assist Britain but still maintain American neutrality. And so cash and carry, we're like, you know what? We'll sell stuff to people, but you have to come and get it, and you have to pay cash for it. Now, thing is, technically, anybody could do it. Technically, Hitler could come take advantage of this, but Hitler didn't have the Navy to take advantage of this. We knew when we put this program into effect that only the British would be able to take advantage of this. And then in 1940, destroyers for bases. Now, what happened here is the British had several bases in the Caribbean, several naval bases in the United States. Not that we necessarily particularly needed to use them, but it was a nice pretext that in return for Britain letting us use these bases in in the Caribbean, we gave or lent Britain, I forget, but we let Britain use, in any case, destroyers. Now, what is a destroyer? What does a destroyer do? My students say a destroyer destroys. Okay, but a destroyer destroys what? A destroyer is an anti-submarine ship. The U-boats. Basically, we're giving Britain these ships that are specialized in fighting submarines and fighting these U-boats. And so then, finally, there's the Lend-Lease Act. And so we're not going to sell Britain military equipment, but we can let Britain borrow military equipment. So you can see why the Great Depression is starting to come to an end now, because the United States is starting to manufacture, to ramp up arms manufacturing, which is putting people to work. So let the British borrow military equipment. And FDR is like, look, if your neighbor wants to borrow your garden hose, then you just let them. You don't tell them that's going to be $15. You say, bring it back when you're done. And so one of my students noted that, we're not talking about garden hoses, we're talking about weapons, okay? But, there we go. And so you want to remember as well, even though the United States still was not in the war at that time, in 1940 we had the first peacetime draft, okay, the Selective Service Act, which was the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. Now remember, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam. Those are the only 4 drafts in the history of the United States. Other than that, we've had an all-volunteer army. Now, this is something, it's like a meme that I found, online, and, the United States, even today just seems to kind of, look at the rest of the world in relation to America. And this was no different than in the 1930s. The America First Committee, all right, they had a celebrity spokesperson, Charles Lindbergh, addressing here an America First rally. And you see there that George Washington, it's kind of low res, but, it's the 1930s. And George Washington is behind him. So what they're doing is they're appealing to this Washingtonian, Jeffersonian foreign policy and saying that we don't need to be getting involved in this foreign war. And so is it peace or is it prejudice? Now, Charles Lindbergh said, in 1941. Now, remember, before December 7th, 1941, the consensus in the United States was not to get involved. He said here, the 3 most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Now, of course, there is a legitimate historiographical debate. Did the Roosevelt administration want to get into the war, or were Roosevelt's policies aimed at keeping the United States out of the war? But the America First Committee went on the assumption that FDR is trying to bring us into war. And so going with that, all right, this, on my original thing here, I don't know if it'll still be, it may still be there, but you can look this up online, is Lindbergh a Nazi? It's a very interesting pamphlet that they've got there. And so as far as that goes, FDR, right before the election, October 30th of 1940, okay, now I showed a 1941 quote, we're going a little backwards. FDR saying here, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. And he says that right before the election here. And he said, and again, that's something that when you look at a campaign promise on foreign policy, imagine if they did the opposite. Now, also note that once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, that, it's not a foreign war anymore. This is a little bit different now. We've been attacked. And, of course, American public opinion shifts very quickly once Pearl Harbor is attacked. So Germany invades Russia in 1941, which causes Russia to join into an alliance with Britain. France is occupied. There's Europe in 1941. You've got the Soviet Union and Britain, but Hitler has taken over much of Europe at that time. So as far as the U.S. entering the war, the Japanese have expanded their empire. So you see that Japan has come all the way out here, and then you see where the United States is right on there. Now you see that Guam, the Philippines, we're right in the middle of these Japanese areas here, where Japanese have gone into China, they have gone in the Pacific, they are surrounding us here, and it's only a matter of time before the United States and Japan get into it. Now, what happens here is that Japan decides to attack first, okay? Now, 3 days before Pearl Harbor, the Chicago Daily Tribune said, oh, here we found FDR's war plans. Now, remember, just because they're war plans doesn't mean somebody wants to go to war. I tell people all the time that I don't want to go to war with Canada, but I certainly hope the government, the military has a plan, like if we had to go to war with Canada. So, just because there are war plans, does that necessarily mean? I mean, it's like we did the Selective Service Act so that we could be prepared for war. So again, was FDR trying to get into the U.S. into the war or not? That is still a matter of discussion. So Japan attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This is one of those dates, along with July 4th, 1776. I would say that this is one where you need to remember this exact date, because before any 1941 document that's before December 7th that you were to look at, you need to be able to know, okay, that's before December 7th, okay? That is when Americans still did not want to enter the war. And so FDR called this a date which will live in infamy. And so now the United States goes from being neutral, declares war on Japan, then Germany and Italy declare war on the United States, and the United States is now part of the Allies. And, it was said here, Admiral Bull Halsey on December 8th, before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. This is very, very visceral, very visceral. And, the propaganda will get very, very real. Avenge December 7th. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, again, I've got a website, tomrichey.net/apush. Remember, the Bill of Rights Institute has a great website as well and a YouTube channel that hopefully you're subscribed to. Those of you who've been asking questions about stuff like the Mexican-American War and stuff like that, make sure check out the previous webinars because we have had, different webinars on different topics. We've been going chronologically here. All right, so as far as this goes, ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions here? Do you think that not retaliating after Pearl Harbor would have kept us out of the war? Beth, I don't think that not retaliating after Pearl Harbor was an option because remember, we don't even know that the Maine was attacked, okay? But all it took was the suspicion. So, Americans have never reacted well to the country being attacked. So I don't see how that necessarily would have been a viable option, okay? Now, I would say as far as specific dates, Kenny, I would say December 7th, 1941, and I would say July 4th, 1776 would be the ones who come out to me. Now, what website is the multiple choice session on tonight? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I will give y'all just a quick direct link here. If you're interested in that multiple choice session, let me just go ahead. I'll send you a direct link to that. That's going to start at 9 p.m. Eastern tonight because I'm going to be broadcasting right after this with Hip Hughes for a bit. Let me see where I can find this. Okay, yeah, the multiple choice strategy session for APUSH. Let me go ahead and just paste this here just so y'all know that that's available to you. Okay, so that's something that if you're interested in that, that's something you're more than welcome to participate in tonight. And if you can't make it live, the archive will be there if you want to get that and look at it on Thursday before you take the exam. All right, the main effects of World War II, one of those would be the United Nations. Now, one thing I think is important to think about the United Nations versus the League of Nations. The League of Nations was built on the principle of equality, okay, equality of nations. It wasn't like some are more equal than others kind of thing. It was very idealistic in its scope. And so as far as that is to be understood, that the United States didn't like the idea of getting into something where we could be forced to act. Now, the United Nations is a little different, okay, because the United Nations is set up so as not to be a threat to American sovereignty, because the allies, the United States, the Soviet Union, or today Russia, China, France, and Britain, they are all on the Security Council, and any of those countries has vetoes. So the UN cannot take any action without the United States approving it, also without Russia approving it, without China approving it, Britain and France approving it. So you've got to have all 5 of these countries on board for the UN to take any action. And so you can see why the United States joined the United Nations and not the League of Nations, because the League of Nations was not set up for the United States to dominate it, whereas the United Nations was set up for the World War II allies to do that. Now, when did FDR start? Now, it doesn't matter, 3 exclamation points. Probably not the best name to pick because I see, this question doesn't matter. FDR started the fireside chats. He did the first one after. Now, remember, this is Googleable, ladies and gentlemen. You can look up. It'll show you all of his fireside chats. And that's one thing that FDR did was he communicated directly with the people, kind of like if it was going to be one-on-one, okay? Like, you're sitting by the fire and the President of the United States is talking directly to you. And that is where you compare that with Herbert Hoover's treatment of the bonus army. When the bonus army marched on Washington, then Douglas MacArthur ran them out of there, burned down their Hooverville, and it made Hoover look like he didn't have any sympathy for these poor people, and FDR looked like he did. All right, the AP Gov session, I'm going to be broadcasting with Hip Hughes at 8 o'clock, okay? So hiphughes.com, okay? So if you're doing, now, and it might not be a bad idea if you're studying for APUSH. The AP Gov stuff, you know, some of it's not going to be on your exam, and some of it will be. All right, so as far as that, ladies and gentlemen, I got that. You know, let's see, Switzerland's a, you know, neutral country. All right. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, okay. So yeah, the multiple choice session is a premium session. That's you know, most of my sessions are free. That's just one that I tend to charge for. So just yeah, that will not be on my YouTube channel. All right. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, let me go into a little bit of World War II propaganda, okay, that I think is important here. And the message here is a message that's pretty simple, a message of shut up, produce, sacrifice, and hate, okay? And the U.S. in World War I and World War II, sorry about that. That's something some Google voice. Let me grab that. Oh, okay. That's actually Hip Hughes trying a little bit early to call me. So, yeah, Hip Hughes and I are going live at 8 on at hiphughes.com or on Hip Hughes' YouTube channel to review for AP Government. All right. Shut up, produce, sacrifice, and hate. All right. So Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and now the United States is brought into the war. And so as far as that goes, a total war that everybody is involved, just like with World War I. This means you. And so shut your mouth. Now, of course, we see here that, you know, this is a, you know, sexist portrayal of women. You know, men run their mouths too. But we see here the stereotypical woman running her mouth. Another thing here, don't fall for enemy propaganda. Now, what I think is funny here against our government, against our allies, and then against Catholic Jews or Protestants. Like, they just put that there, you know, as if there's like all this anti-Protestant propaganda going on or something like that. Now, look at this. Now, this is, remember, Hitler and the Japs are trying to get us fighting among ourselves. So they've got a, you know, pejorative term for the Japanese. Now, notice how the Japanese also tend to be heavily caricatured, okay, with these big mouths, and they look like they are, you know, something other than human, okay? Now, don't start forest fires. That's exactly what Hitler and the Japanese want you to do. Crack the axis with uninterrupted production. Government regulation of production, pricing, and rationing. Now, this is basically the New Deal taken to war. FDR has, you know, expanded government in the New Deal, and we start to see that expansion carry into the war economy as well. Everything's regulated. The War Production Board oversaw the peacetime industries being converted to war production. And then you see here, we need more production, tanks, planes, guns, ships, all right? And so, you know, a good soldier sticks to his post. And that includes soldiers of production. So if you were working in a factory, you'd see stuff like this. The soldiers aren't just on the front. They're also producing. And we see here, that is, wow, okay? I mean, this is one of those, I look at it and it's just like, wow. What you make can prevent this. I mean, it sends a very strong message. And then this is a Texaco poster, okay? This is a corporate poster. Go ahead, please, take day off. So when you take a day off, you are helping the enemy. Now, Rosie the Riveter was symbolic of female munitions workers. Now, this is kind of something that, you know, is sort of getting into the modern feminist movement, because women were called upon to work in these munitions factories. And then, of course, after the war, when the men came back, they're supposed to go back to making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so there is a woman riveting, okay? That's doing the rivets here. Now, here's the thing that, you know, there was FDR's Executive Order 8802, prohibited racial discrimination in the defense production industry. So anybody that was going to get federal money for defense contracting had to show that they were also providing jobs for African Americans. The Office of Price Administration controlled price ceilings. You see here that everything here, it said it's filed with the War Price and Rationing Board. So, when you look at that, the hamburger steak better be 25 cents, okay? 2 boiled eggs, 20 cents. Bacon and 2 eggs, 40 cents, all right? Everybody's charging the same prices. Nobody's competing with each other. We're all in this together. It is your patriotic duty to pay these prices. And we see here food is a weapon. Don't waste it, all right? Now, the thing is that, remember, during World War I, it was voluntary. Now, this is not voluntary. There is rationing. Well, you have a problem with rationing? Well, this is what happens when there's not rationing. Somebody takes too much. And so without rationing, now here is with rationing. Everybody's got their ration book, and everybody's so happy with their rations. What a wonderful piece of propaganda. Of course, this comes from the Office of Price Administration. And so you would get your ration book here. And you don't want to be defrauding the government with the ration books. That is basically telling you don't mess with that, all right? Now, mileage stamps and stuff like that. You've got a stamp with an aircraft carrier on it. Now, waste fats for explosives. Take them to your meat dealer. Don't waste anything. Don't pour out the bacon grease. Share the meat, all right? So this is about all you need per week of meat. And, the rest of it needs to win the war. Waste helps the enemy conserve material. So you got a little Hitler paper there, all right? And then a Jap trap, and so a car club. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Now, the Office of War Mobilization, James F. Burns, who was a South Carolinian, coordinated all government war-related agencies. And then dehumanizing the enemy. This is the enemy. This is the enemy. Now, this one is really interesting because this is one of those when you move your hand, you'll see that this follows you. It's like the Mona Lisa of propaganda posters. And so as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we are running out of time, but I think you get the drift of the World War II propaganda. And again, ladies and gentlemen, it's as far as being able to hit everything, we're not necessarily able to do that. Now, Japanese internment camps, we definitely want to know about that. Korematsu versus the United States. Note that the Japanese internment of American citizens was upheld during by the Supreme Court, and the United States government has since apologized for that and issued reparations in the 1980s under Reagan. Selena, glad you enjoyed it, and remember, tell your friends as we're going into the night before the exam. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Maddie, who will, let you know what the Bill of Rights Institute has for you. And I'd like to thank the Bill of Rights Institute once again for having me over, and make sure to check out their YouTube channel and their other resources.
All right, thank you so much, Tom. So like he was saying, the Bill of Rights Institute also has a lot of resources that you guys can utilize while you're doing this last-minute studying. I really encourage you guys to go ahead and look at our YouTube page. So that's going to have all of our homework help videos, which is going to help you, and it's also going to have all the recordings from the previous webinars. So tonight's webinar is going to go up tomorrow on the YouTube page, and then our very last webinar for